Hello, amazing readers. Are you ready for chapter 4 in Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle? Remember that this chapter is about the selfishness cure. Oh my goodness. Look at that. That's when you don't share. It's being selfish. So here we go. The selfishness cure. Dickie Thompson was certainly a nice-looking boy, and he was smart in school and behaved well at the table. But whenever his name was mentioned, people said, poor Mrs. Thompson. She has such a problem. Whatever will she do with that child? I guess that you would feel simply dreadful if people said a thing like that when your name was mentioned, but Dickie didn't. You see, Dickie Thompson was a selfish, greedy boy, and he cared more about being a selfish, greedy boy than about what people said. When children came over to his house to play, Dickie said, "Don't touch that, that's mine. You can't play with that, that's mine. Put down my ball. Take off my skates." Each time this happened, at least each time it happened where his mother could hear Dickie saying, "That's mine," she would send him up to his room to think about how selfish he was. Dickie would go right upstairs, for he was very obedient. But instead of thinking how bad it was to be selfish, he would sit on the bed and swing his legs and think, "Everything in this room is mine, and nobody is going to touch my things." He certainly was a problem. One day, Dickie's mother bought a big box of peppermint sticks. She called Dickie into the house and said, "Now, dear, I have bought this large box of peppermint sticks for you, but I want you to share them with your friends. There are about 50 sticks in the box, and I want you to divide them with all the children in the neighborhood. Don't forget the little children, Dickie, and you might send one or two to old Mrs. Bury. She is so fond of peppermint." Dickie said, "Thank you, Mother, for the fine candy." Then he took the box out of doors and put it in the basket on the front of his bicycle and allowed the neighborhood children to look at the peppermint sticks. But he warned them, "This is my candy, and if anyone touches it, I will hit him with my baseball bat." The children in the neighborhood had known Dickie for some time, and they knew that he meant what he said. But as they looked at the candy, they wished and wished they could have just one stick. Dickie's mother, watching from the window, saw all the children gathered around Dickie and the box of candy in the basket on the front of his bicycle, and she thought to herself, "Just look at my little Dickie dividing the candy with all of his little friends. I just knew he would learn to be generous." And she tapped on the window, and when Dickie looked around, she waved and smiled at him. Dickie waved and smiled back, but unfortunately, just then, Mary O'Toole, who was quite daring, reached in and grabbed a stick of the candy, and crack! Dickie clouted her on the hand with the baseball bat. In a flash, his mother saw what was going on. She flew out the front door, took Dickie firmly by the arm, and marched him upstairs, thrust him into his room, and slammed the door. Then she went downstairs and out the front door, took the box of candy, and told Mary O'Toole to divide it among all the children, even the little ones, and to take one or two sticks over to old Mrs. Bury because she was so fond of peppermint. There were 15 children, not counting Dickie, and 50 sticks of candy. So each child was given 3 sticks, and old Mrs. Bury got 5. From the window of his bedroom, Dickie watched Mary divide the candy, and he was just furious. After all the candy had been divided, I'm going to do that one again. After all the candy had been divided, Mrs. Thompson went into the house and called Dickie's father. She said, "Herbert, I know that you are busy and you don't like to have me call you at the office, but I'm so worried about Dickie." Dickie's father said, "What's the matter? Is he sick?" Dickie's mother said, "No, but I just wish he were. It would be so much simpler." Mr. Thompson said, "Now, dear, I'm very busy, so perhaps you had better wait until I come home." Mrs. Thompson said, "Herbert, this cannot wait another minute." And she told him about the candy and the baseball bat. Mr. Thompson said, "Why not give him a good hard spanking? Tell him that you are going to give him something that he can keep all to himself. Ha ha." "Now, Herbert, this is not a laughing matter, and I don't think a spanking will solve a thing. I just don't know what to do or which way to turn," said Mrs. Thompson. And she began to cry, partly because she felt so humiliated over Dickie's selfishness, and partly because she knew that crying was one way to get action out of Dickie's father. Dickie's father said, Now, dear, tears won't help. Let me see. Shall I hop into a taxi and come home and thrash Dickie?" Dickie's mother only cried louder. Dickie's father said, I know just what to do. Call that Mrs. Wriggle-Spiggle, or whatever her name is. You know, the one who cured Hubert Prentice." "You mean Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle? Oh, Herbert, you are so wonderful. I knew you would think of something. I'll call her right away," said Mrs. Thompson. She blew her nose and cheered right up. Mothers always do cheer up when they think of Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle because she knows so much about children. After all, she has had about 1,000 little boys and girls come to her house to pull taffy, play checkers, bake cookies, drink cambric tea, and dig for the pirate gold buried in the backyard. And so she has had plenty of opportunity to learn about childish ailments and the cures for them. She was certainly the person to ask about Dickie, the selfish boy. So Mrs. Thompson telephoned her. She said, "Hello, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. This is Mrs. Thompson, Dickie's mother." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Hello, Mrs. Thompson. I had rather expected you to call." Mrs. Thompson said, "You have? Why?" "Because I know Dickie very well," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. "And although he is a dear little boy and the most well-mannered child who comes to visit me, never once forgetting to say thank you and please, he is very selfish." "Oh, I know he is, said Mrs. Thompson, almost crying because she was so ashamed that Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle should know how selfish Dickie was. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Now, Mrs. Thompson, do not feel sad. Selfishness and greediness are just diseases like measles and chickenpox and can be cured very easily. But we must start now before another day passes, because Dickie is such a nice little boy and we want everyone to like him as we do." "Oh, do you like him in spite of his selfishness?" asked Dickie's mother. "Of course I do," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. "I love all children, but it distresses me when I see a child who has a disease like selfishness or answer-backism or won't put away toys-itis, and his parents don't do a thing to cure him." "But I want to cure Dickie," said his mother. "I will do anything to cure him." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "The selfishness cure is really very simple, but the rules must be followed very strictly. You will have to come down here and get my selfishness kit, and at the same time, I will give you the directions for its use." "Thank you, dear Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle," said Mrs. Thompson. "I will leave right now." And she hung up the phone, slipped on a jacket, and ran all the way to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's house. When she arrived, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle was on the front porch waiting for her. On the porch beside her was a quite a large green metal box with Selfishness Kit painted on its side in white letters. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle invited Dickie's mother to sit down, and then she opened the kit. Inside were about 25 padlocks of various sizes. There were great big ones about the size of apples, down to little tiny ones not much larger than a penny. Also, there were screws and a screwdriver, a box of cloth labels that said Dickie, a box of blank gummed labels, a small can of white paint, a small can of black paint, a small paintbrush, and a pastry bag. This is a large bag with a nozzle on the end which, when filled with frosting, can be squeezed, and the frosting comes out the end like toothpaste and can be formed into words. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Mrs. Thompson, these padlocks are for Dickie's drawers, his closets, his toy chest, his bicycle, his bedroom door, his nightstand, his drawer, and his toothbrush. As soon as you get home, put the padlocks on everything he owns and give him the keys. This is to assure him that he, and he alone, can touch his things. The name labels are to be sewn in all of his clothes, and the gum stickers are to be put in all of his books, even his school books. Notebooks, pencil boxes are to be pasted on his ruler, crayons, and paints. On each sticker, print in large letters with this black paint, Dickie's book, don't touch. Dickie's notebook, don't touch, and so forth. On every toy he owns, you must paint in either black or white paint, Dickie's ball, don't touch, or Dickie's bat, don't touch. Put the name of the toy first, and then don't touch." The pastry bag is to be filled with a simple white frosting and used to mark Dickie's sandwiches, his fruit, his cookies, and his plate for each meal. That's all there is to it. I expect you will be returning the Selfishness Kit before a week has passed. Mrs. Thompson said, "I do hope so, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. Are you sure it will work? It has cured hundreds of other children, and I see no reason why it should not cure Dickie. A week or even less, I should say." Mrs. Thompson thanked Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle very much, and then, lugging the kit, she walked home. As soon as she had hung up her jacket, she began sewing the labels in all of Dickie's clothes. He asked her what she was doing, and when she showed him, he was as happy as could be. "Boy, that will just show people who owns my clothes," he said proudly. Mrs. Thompson did not answer, but continued to put the labels on every single stitch of his clothing, including his socks and his handkerchiefs. Then she opened the kit and took out the tiniest padlock. She fastened Dickie's toothbrush to the toothbrush rack with the little padlock, snapped it shut, and handed the key, which was not much bigger than a pin, to Dickie. "You had better find a ring to hold your keys," she said. "You are going to have about 25 of them." "Boy, that's just wonderful," Dickie said, fondling the tiny key and thinking, "That's my toothbrush, and now nobody but me can touch it." He was very happy. When dinner time came, Mrs. Thompson closed the Selfishness Kit and took it downstairs to show Dickie's father. She told him about Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, and he patted her on the back and said that he was sure everything was going to be all right. And where was the evening paper? After dinner, they went upstairs to put some of the padlocks on and were surprised to find that Dickie himself had already put the locks on each of his bureau drawers, his nightstand drawer, his toy box, his closet door, and his bedroom door. He had also put stickers on the covers of all of his books, notebooks, coloring books, crayons, and colored pencil boxes, and stamp album. On the stickers, he had printed in black paint, "Dickie's book, don't touch. Dickie's notebook, don't touch. Dickie's crayons, don't touch. Dickie's pencil box, don't touch. Dickie's stamp album, don't touch." He was very proud and asked his father if he didn't think he printed well. His father said, "You should be able to print well. You have certainly practiced enough." And he looked disgusted around the room at the stickers which labeled everything. "Dickie's brush, don't touch. Dickie's comb, don't touch. Dickie's window blind, don't touch." He turned to Dickie's mother and said, "Perhaps we should wear stickers. Dickie's mother, don't touch. Dickie's father, don't touch. I'll bet he'll wear monogrammed underwear when he grows up." Mrs. Thompson said, "Oh, I hope not, Herbert." Dickie said, "Come on, Mom and Dad, let's mark all the rest of my stuff." And so they worked until 8:30, marking Dickie's bicycle, his baseball, his bat, his pitcher's glove, his catcher's glove, his toolbox, his roller skates, his lunchbox, his rubber boots, his raincoat, his space suit, his soldier suit, his gun, and his wagon. They even painted "Dickie's dog, don't touch" on Rover's collar. When they had finished and it was time for Dickie to go to bed, he kissed his mother and said goodnight to his father and went happily up the stairs, his ring of keys jingling from his belt. Mr. Thompson sank down into a chair in the living room and lit his pipe. "I trust that Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle knows what she's doing," he said, "because if this cure should not work, our son Dickie is going to be the most loathsome boy in the whole world." Mrs. Thompson said, "Oh, no, dear, not in the whole world." The next morning, they heard Dickie clicking and snapping at his padlocks long before they were up. He was a little late coming downstairs because it took time to padlock all his drawers, his closet door, and the door of his room, but he was very happy, and his mother noticed that he had pinned one of the name labels on the outside of his sweater. While he was eating his breakfast marked, "Dickie's breakfast, don't touch," his mother marked his sandwiches, "Dickie's sandwiches, don't touch," and his apple, "Dickie's apple, don't touch," and his cookies, "Dickie's cookies, don't touch." His lunchbox had already been marked, "Dickie's lunchbox, don't touch." After breakfast, Dickie put the lunchbox in the basket on his bicycle and noticed proudly the large sign hanging from the crossbar, "Dickie's bicycle, don't touch." At school, the children paid little attention to the sign on his bicycle, but when he opened his lunchbox and took out the sandwiches marked "Dickie's sandwiches, don't touch," and the apple marked "Dickie's apple, don't touch," and the cookies marked "Dickie's cookie, don't touch," everyone laughed and wanted to see them, and in the resulting crowding and pushing, one of the sandwiches was dropped and stepped on, and some of the big boys grabbed the apple and tossed it in the air just above Dickie's head, shouting, "Throw me Dickie's apple! Oh, look, I dropped Dickie's apple. I wonder if Dickie's apple will bounce." When they finally gave Dickie his apple, it was bruised and very dirty. In arithmetic period that afternoon, Bobby Slater across the aisle asked Dickie for his ruler, and when he saw the label, "Dickie's ruler, don't touch," he began to laugh and reached over and snatched the ruler off Dickie's desk and passed it to Kenny Hatch, who laughed and passed it to the girl in front of him, and finally Miss Crabtree had to come down and get it. When she saw the sign, she laughed too, but she gave the ruler back to Dickie. After school, the boys decided to play baseball in the vacant lot by Dickie's house, but when Dickie brought out his bat and ball and mitts, and the boys saw Dickie's ball, don't touch. Dickie's bat, don't touch. They said, we can't touch anything, so let's go home. And they did. Dickie went up to his room to play, but he found that somewhere during the day he had lost the key to his closet and that he had locked the key to his toy chest in the chest. So he went down and sat on the front porch and listened to the shouts of children playing in Hubert Prentice's yard. The next morning at school during recess, nobody would play with him, and the little girls followed him and laughed. When they marched into school, the children pointed and laughed, and Miss Crabtree came down to see what the trouble was, and she almost laughed herself when she saw the sign someone had pinned on the back of Dickie's sweater. It said, "This is Dickie, don't touch." So there's a picture. At lunchtime, the children crowded around to watch him take out his sandwiches, and one little girl said, "He's so selfish and greedy, he has his sandwiches marked so he can't share them." Then the children danced around him and chanted, "Dickie's sandwich, don't touch. Dickie's apple, don't touch. Dickie's lunchbox, don't touch." Finally, Dickie took his lunchbox out and put it in the basket on his bicycle, but the children followed him, and seeing the big sign, "Dickie's bicycle, don't touch," they yelled and laughed and sang, "Dickie's, don't touch Dickie. Dickie's, don't touch Dickie." After school, Dickie hurried right home, but he had lost the key to his room, so he went down to the basement to play with his toolbox. But every time he saw the large white sign, "Dickie's toolbox, don't touch," he thought of school and the lunchbox and remembered how the children laughed and jeered, and he was ashamed. At dinner, when his mother brought him his plate marked "Dickie's dinner, don't touch," he said, "Why do you have to mark my plate? I don't care which one I get." Mrs. Thompson looked significantly at Mr. Thompson and said, "All right, Dickie, we won't mark your plate if you will share your dessert with Rover." Dickie thought for a minute, and then he carefully broke his chocolate cake into 2 equal pieces and gave one to Rover, who gulped it down and looked grateful. After dinner, Dickie told his father that he had lost the keys to his room and the closet, and so his father took off the padlocks on those doors and on the toy box. Dickie said, "Don't put them back, Dad. I don't care who goes into my room or gets into my stuff." The next morning, Dickie got up early and scraped the Dickie's lunchbox, "Don't touch," from his lunchbox and took the sign off his bicycle. Then he went in to his mother and said, "Mom, please don't mark my sandwiches. Please don't mark any of my stuff, Mom." Mrs. Thompson said, "All right, Dickie. I only did it to protect you." Dickie said, "I don't care who gets my lunch. Just don't mark it." At noon, all the children gathered around Dickie, but neither his sandwiches, nor his apple, nor his lunchbox were marked. So they rushed out to see his bicycle, but there was no sign on it. So they sat down and ate their lunches. Right after school that night, Dickie hurried home and scraped the marking off his baseball and bat and mitts, and then he walked up to where the children were playing ball, and tossing the ball, bat, and mitts down beside the catcher, he said, "Do you want to use these? I don't care." And he went back to his own house. In a little while, Mary O'Toole rang the doorbell and asked Mrs. Thompson if Dickie could come out and play. Mrs. Thompson said, "He'd love to, Mary, but first he must return something to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle." Mary said, "Tell him to come over to the lot when he gets back, and here are some keys he lost." Mrs. Thompson said, "Thank you for the keys, dear, but thank goodness they belong to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, not to Dickie." She took the keys of the big padlocks and the tiny padlock up to Dickie, who was in his room, busily packing Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's selfishness kit. The end of chapter 4. So he learned that it was not a good thing to be selfish. And by the way, boys and girls, this book was written a long time ago when they didn't know certain things. And don't ever give your dog chocolate. It's very bad for him. But I'm sure Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle didn't know that. I'll see you next time.